Infrastructure in Society Next Gen Engagement Program, our second in our webinar series, with today's panel focusing on COVID, trust, and the future of transport. I'm Sarah Weiss, and I'm joined today by some amazing expert panelists, as well as our industry director, Kirsty O'Connell. And we're really excited to spend the next 90 minutes with you discussing this very relevant and timely theme. Today we are joined by Professor Mark Stevenson from the University of Melbourne and Heidi Cooper up in Queensland. I will spend a bit more time introducing you to them in detail in a moment. But what we're really excited to do together in this webinar is to take a critical look at some of the recent trends and emerging issues and research that's starting to come out around the travel intentions of commuters and workers post-pandemic, and the potential implications of that for transport infrastructure, for congestion, for the very important considerations around climate change mitigation, and for the way that we build a social license for public and private transport infrastructure. So here at all of our Next Gen events, we do tend to have a really wonderful group of industry leaders participating in our audience, and we'd like to welcome you all today. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm broadcasting from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in beautiful Melbourne, Victoria. And I'd like to pay my respects to Indigenous leaders, past and present, in all of the places from which you are joining us today. So as we get started, I do want to just point out, for those of you who may be new to Zoom webinars, we have a super handy Q&A feature. And so that's going to allow you to participate with us today. We're certain that you have a lot of questions, comments, and ideas that you would like to share and to really engage in discussion with our expert panelists. So please do use that Q&A feature. Kirsty O'Connell will be monitoring and moderating that for us throughout the session today. And we may read some of those questions out. We may call on you to jump in and voice your question as well. So be ready for that. We hope to have all of you participating and really engaging in a lot of discussion. So I wanted to kind of set the scene today, and I should say we are recording as well. I wanted to kind of set the scene today first to give you a bit of an idea for those of you who are new to the infrastructure industry or to our webinars. The Next Generation Engagement Program, in which our research and this webinar series is based, is a world-first, industry-led effort to really understand the impact of community engagement in delivering major infrastructure projects. We research social risk, social license to operate. We look at the standards of excellence in community engagement practice to help support not only on time, on budget, infrastructure project delivery, but also to help achieve the very best outcomes for communities. So this is a really outcomes focused, we think very timely, and we hope accessible program of research. We're really lucky that we are housed at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. And earlier this year, we were able to formally establish the Infrastructure in Society Institute, which sits within the College of Asia and the Pacific at the ANU, which is a place that I love, but because I've been stuck in Melbourne, haven't been since February. So I'm enjoying the surrounds of beautiful Melbourne at the moment. In the Institute, we are really lucky to be able to draw on the research powerhouse that is the ANU, and we hope through these sessions and webinars like this, we're drawing and expanding on even more expertise throughout our network. We do have a number of fantastic partners as well who join us in our work. And I would like to turn over now to our industry director, Kirsty O'Connell, to tell you a bit more about this, and also for those of you who might be interested, how you can become involved. Kirsty, I am hopeful that your audio is now working for you. And the answer may be no. So that's great. As a professional facilitator, I'm going to plow through. We just really want to take a moment to thank our industry partners. This group that you can see here, including, and we know we have representatives from each of you today, Lend-Lease, the Queensland Government, the Victorian Major Transport Infrastructure Authority, Transurban, and IAP2 serve as our major partners, and we are welcoming a number of other supporting partners, many of you who are also with us today. So it is absolutely terrific to have you with us. Kirsty, did you want to come in now if you were able to get your sound working? This is the fun of 2020, isn't it, everyone? We all say, you're on mute. Okay, well, if Kirsty, if you're able to, there we are. Hello, yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, everybody. That took a lot of doing this morning, an unusual amount of doing. So I guess the only thing I'd like to add, Sarah, is that we're really conscious that we're creating more than an evidence base, and that what we're really trying to create is an ecosystem that fosters that better engagement and provides a really safe space for industry professionals to share the lessons that they've learned, and also a space where we can act as an honest broker, providing insights on community perceptions and expectations of infrastructure delivery. So that ecosystem, though, really requires industry participation to thrive, and it is. Our network of partners is growing all the time. It includes the Queensland and Victorian governments, Lend-Lease, Transurban, and the International Associations of Public Participation. And our partners are making a lot more than a cash contribution to the work that we do. They make an intellectual and an in-kind contribution, and it's really that that helps to drive our program forward. We're extremely proud to say that we've had more than 85 different infrastructure organisations contribute to our work to date, and that list is growing all the time. So if there are people in the audience who are part of organisations that would like to be part of the work, that would like to close a relationship, then do please feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to talk to you about the opportunities that exist now. So I'd like to introduce today's panellists. We are delighted, and we couldn't be more pleased, to be joined by two leading transport thinkers. We have Heidi Cooper, who is the Head of Public Affairs for the Queensland and also Group Strategic Projects at Transurban, and she's responsible for their corporate social responsibility portfolio. We also have Professor Mark Stevenson, who's an epidemiologist and a Professor of Urban Transport and Public Health at the University of Melbourne. And we will tell you a little bit more about Heidi and Mark later in the program. But first, I'd like to introduce my colleague and our moderator for today, Professor, newly promoted, Professor Sarah Bice. We're very excited about this promotion. Is the Research Director for the Next Generation Engagement Program and the Director of the Institute for Infrastructure in Society. She is one of the world's leading authors, speakers and researchers in the field of social licence, and brings a wealth of experience in impact assessment and consultancy globally. In fact, this last year she was named the Impact Assessment Professional of the Year by the International Association for Impact Assessment. Sarah, I'd love to hand over to you to provide us with an overview of some of the changes and recent pieces of research that have come out with regard to COVID trust and the future of public transport. Sarah.
Kirsty, thank you so much, and thank you for overcoming the technological challenges that are part and parcel of 2020. I really look forward to seeing you personally in 2021. I wanted to take some time this morning to really set the scene about these issues that we're going to be discussing together today, to think about COVID, trust, and then the future of transport. Kirsty and I spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, and there was an article recently around about October in The Age when we were in the midst of 22-hour-a-day lockdown here in Melbourne, and it really sparked more of this conversation that Kirsty and I had already been having earlier in the year about how was the pandemic going to shape the future of transport, and in particular, how was the pandemic going to potentially create or exacerbate tensions between transport use choices and climate change mitigation? How might there be opportunities that arise unexpectedly from the pandemic? So how could this assist us to perhaps accelerate or be more innovative and dynamic in our future transport and urban planning? And there was an article in The Age around about October in the midst of lockdown, and this study was done by a private consulting firm, Movement in Place, and that study predicted that post-pandemic inbound traffic into Melbourne would rise by an estimated 68% on the West Gate alone. And so we really started to think about, what does this then mean for people's experiences of transport, and how are they going to start to potentially trade off or change the concerns around individual biosecurity, their own ideas or ideals about climate change mitigation, and the types of transport use decisions that they take. Current modeling at the moment suggests that there will be up to a 70% decline in public transport trips in the Melbourne CBD alone. And at present, we know that car use has returned to pre-COVID levels in Sydney, Brisbane, and Perth, while demand for public transport has not bounced back quite as much. So that's been about 30 to 50% below average use in those cities. We're also starting to see larger companies beginning to bulk lease parking. So there are some changes happening there. And the other thing that's been a real positive, and certainly anecdotally, this is something that I see around my own area in inner city Melbourne, is that active transport is really on the rise. So walking and cycling have increased substantially. And a recent Transurban study, which Heidi will talk more about in a moment, actually suggested about that active transport, particularly cycling in Melbourne, has increased by 1/3 as of July. The other things that are related to this are the changes like what you can see now, working from home. And so we think globally that working from home is likely to continue, and that the trends that we talk about today are things that are being reflected internationally. So this is going to be interesting to see what happens. Looking towards transport changes in particular, a recent study from Monash University, their public transport research group, tells us that we think public transport usage in Melbourne is going to bounce back, but probably to only about 80% of pre-pandemic levels. So we do think that car driving and the consequent congestion will also increase as a result. And we know that safety on public transport presents a concern for commuters. Fears of contracting the virus, concerns about whether or not we can social distance on board buses and trains and trams, and some of the changes recently in Melbourne that we've experienced where it's really great to have more liberty around the mask use requirements, but that also can lead to confusion. When do I need to have the mask on? When do I need to have it off? You forget your mask, all these types of things that are quite practical and individual, but that really do have systemic consequences when we're in a pandemic environment. We also know that people are still a bit wary of cities, despite the fact that we can celebrate today, particularly here in Victoria, that we've got another 0 day and 0 cases. But 1 in 5 commuters are saying that they are really less likely to travel into the CBD here in Melbourne. So there are some continuing and very fair concerns about exposure and about being in crowds. A recent report from WSP Australia actually recommend that maybe what we should do is have a stage approach to distancing on public transport. So moving from strict to moderate to relaxed, these kind of COVID safe levels. The key here is that all of these scenarios would effectively lower the capacity of public transport. So we would also need to think about changing timetables and perhaps amending work hours as well to allow for that spread across public transport. And commentator and demographer Bernard Salt wrote recently that his prediction is that people are going to be super vigilant about hygiene for the coming future, and that's going to be very top of mind. And safety and personal health are going to become major influencers around people's transport decision-making to perhaps an extent or in a way that it hasn't occurred in the past. We know that safety has always been amongst the very top themes influencing people's transport usage choice, but now Bernard Salt at least is predicting it's going to become #1. And certainly when Heidi speaks about the Our Mobility Report from Transurban, this is a theme we've seen reflected in Australia. I love this photo. I don't know who this lady is, but her children are not my children. Look at them. They're just back there behaving themselves. I don't even think they're on an iPad. I think that is an actual notebook. So good for her. That is not what my house looked like during homeschooling. I'm just going to tell you right now. But Bernard Salt also estimates that work from home rates jumped at least 5%, from 5% of the workforce to 30 to 35% of the workforce across Australia during the pandemic. And obviously in Melbourne during our long and rigorous lockdown, it was much higher than that. Look, a lot of people want to go back to the office. I'd love to go back to my office. Inevitably, though, he thinks that perhaps about 15% of workers are likely to choose that they will still stay working from home. So that's really something interesting to consider. I have a number of colleagues here working in Victorian government, and certainly the Victorian government, because they are really setting the standard and demonstrating, leadership by doing. There's an expectation that most Victorian public servants will continue to work from home for some time to come, so they're a bit slower to get back into the office. What we know is that these trends around working from home, the changes to public transport, increased active transport, which personally I'm enjoying because a friend gave me a bicycle. These things are being reported worldwide. So this is not just an Australian trend and not just an Australian issue. The World Economic Forum is suggesting policy measures now where government and business would actually put in policy around staggered workplace hours, around more flexible workplace agreements, things like pay-as-you-park, incentives for active transport, and that can run all the way from the systemic incentives for active transport infrastructure through to individualized incentives for citizens, and thinking about removal of vehicles as part of salary packaging. So trying to discourage that uptake of individual vehicles. And that comes from the World Economic Forum. Forbes magazine, which always has a number of interesting reads, their US-based publication recently released a study from the very, I'm sure, research robust cars.com. But interestingly, I think it's worthwhile sharing the statistics. They surveyed a number of Americans about commuting, ride sharing, public transport use, and they found that more than a third of Americans, even in a policy and regulatory environment where people are not necessarily being formally restricted from leaving home, about 1/3 of Americans are currently working from home. So people are taking individual choices to protect their health. And 30% of those individuals who are currently working in an office are reporting that they are going in less often. So they're commuting less frequently. And they're also reporting that these changes are ones that they are likely to maintain. So the pandemic, for better or for worse, seems to be creating a situation in which we are perhaps accelerating changes that may have been on the threshold. That same study that found workers who were returning to the office and doing so were doing so by car. So the other interesting thing is, as people go back to the office, studies are showing that they are choosing cars over public transport, and we will see if that statistic holds. And this is something that we're really pleased to be able to talk to Mark and Heidi about today, and they're going to help us to think through some of these issues based on their own expertise. I wanted to close off my introductory discussion with some global trends and innovation. I think what's really interesting in this situation is that the ways in which the pandemic has really catalyzed changes that may have implications for transport sustainability. So while the tensions may have increased between car usage and climate change mitigation, you can also see that desires for active transport and the infrastructure to support that active transport are also on the rise. So here in Melbourne, the recently elected Deputy Lord Mayor, Nick Rees, he notes how the Italian city of Milan, back in February, when they were really hard hit by the pandemic, they have already now converted 35 kilometers of roadway to cycling and more pedestrian-friendly thoroughfares. So we're seeing that active transport boost. In Dublin and Ireland, some street parking has been removed to create wider footpaths so that citizens there can achieve social distancing a little bit easier. And in New Zealand, which always stands out as a policy and practice leader when there's necessity for change, we're seeing them continue their long-running policy of what they call tactical urbanism. So they're using pop-up infrastructure to alter footpaths and bike lanes, and they're really conscientiously shifting that infrastructure to support social distancing and doing things like allowing extra space for queuing outside of shops. So a lot of pragmatic and practical measures are being taken in response to the pandemic. And the question today will be, what do we think about these trends and these innovations? What's going to stick around? What's problematic? And what's a huge opportunity that we should attempt to take on? So Kirsty before noted that we are joined by two amazing panelists today, and we are really pleased to have them with us. Those panelists are Heidi Cooper and Mark Stevenson, and I just want to take a moment to give them their proper due. Heidi Cooper is a senior executive with more than 20 years experience in the corporate sector. Heidi is head of Public Affairs Queensland, and she is Group Strategic Projects Head at Transurban, and she comes to us today from Brisbane. Heidi is a lawyer by background, and she specialized in providing strategic advice to the top 20 ASX companies with large growth agendas and significant social impact. Heidi's work has focused on positively influencing the political environment, shaping regulatory reform, enhancing reputations, mitigating external risk, and fostering public trust. Heidi Cooper, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the panel today, and I'd love to turn over to you now for you to share some of your insights from your perspective and experience in Brisbane and at Transurban. Heidi Cooper.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome everyone. It is wonderful to be here today. I think, as Sarah said, 2020, we have all become technology experts, and it's extraordinary what we can do now. And I'm so pleased that we can come together, but hopefully in the future there'll be another time when we can get together, face to face. But technology has definitely enabled us to spend time together and, have people from all different parts of Australia and the world, for that matter, to come together and talk about important topics. And this is definitely one of those very important topics, and it's a very interesting topic. And I think one of the things that we're all grappling with at the moment is, what does our life look like, come 2021 and beyond? And the pandemic has had a significant impact on all of our lives, and from a health and economic perspective, the impact has been extraordinary. And I think a lot of people are thinking, as Sarah has already outlined in her introduction, around what does that mean, and what do things look like going forward? And there's lots of information, there's lots of data. And at Transurban, we thought we really wanted to try to understand that a little bit more. We're a major company in Australia and in Northern America, but we are also, we're a part of people's lives. And so it was important for us to understand as much as we could about, what does this new future, look like? So we commissioned a mobility report, which was to try and get a snapshot of what people were thinking about their life now, but also what life would look like in the future. And that was around how they were going to move around cities. And it was all parts of movement. So it was for work, but it was also for life. It was for socializing. And what did people think? So we surveyed 4,500 people across Australia and North America to capture their views on what they thought life would look like, particularly once the health risk eased. So we were trying to understand, there's obviously a very dramatic impact to our lives right now, but what do people think the next phase might look like? And it's hard, to answer that question. It's hard for anyone to answer that question, but we did get a sense of sentiment. And the results were really interesting, because what it showed is that even though there has been a very significant impact on our lives, and in no way can that be underestimated, 42% of people expected that life would return to normal to some degree within 12 months. So that was a really optimistic position that people had. And it's also an indication that a lot of people, whilst our life has been disrupted, we do think that we will be able to return to some sort of normality, regardless of what that normality is, within that 12-month period. The other thing that was really interesting in the research is that the workplace is far from obsolete in people's minds. And that was interesting because there has been a lot of commentary about what working from home means and what that looks like. Now, obviously, working from home is a very important part of our lives, and I think was on the rise even before the pandemic. And Sarah, to your point, the pandemic has accelerated a lot of these areas of our lives. But the thing that was interesting from our research was that the overwhelming majority of people, so about 86% of people, expected to return to the workplace once the health risk had passed. And that's the important bit. I think that people are still considering very much their own personal safety in this scenario, but they're also human beings. And as human beings, we know that we crave people. And that was the overwhelming sentiment that came out from the research, was that people are missing interactions with their colleagues. They're missing being able to talk to people, to run into people in the corridor, the efficiencies that unintended interactions bring to our work life. And that was a really strong part that came out in the survey. The other thing that people expressed was that they are missing the boundaries that can exist between work and home. And I think having spent time at home, Brisbane to a different degree to Melbourne, that is really challenging. And I think your photo was fantastic, Sarah, because I can guarantee my house did not look like that. And so it is, we can understand people's sentiment in this space. The other piece that was interesting, and it aligns with some of the commentary that Sarah has already shared, is what people are looking for when they choose a transport option. And what has always been the case, or typically the case up until the pandemic, is that people would choose convenience. So what is the most convenient way for me to get to where I want to be? What has shifted is safety. And even though safety has always been in that top number of results whenever we've asked this question, safety has now become the overwhelming number one reason why people will choose a particular mode of transport. But I think the really important thing is that people view safety in a whole heap of different ways, and they may choose a lot of different options as to how they deem their safe route to work. And I think what's really important is that it is a combination of things, and the transport system has always been a multimodal system, and it's really important that continues because people are definitely expressing that. So driving at the moment is a consideration, but so is active transport. And Sarah, I know that you mentioned some of that, but we saw that 27% increase in people wanting to cycle, which I think almost so many people I know have bought bikes during this time. Active transport, walking is another one, but public transport also came up as well. So I think it's a combination of things, and we can't necessarily assume what people are going to choose, and people are thinking differently. And I'm a case in point for that. When we first returned to the office, I did drive in and I parked, and really quickly I realised that all I was doing was sort of sitting in my car all day, and I didn't want to do that. And so for a combination of reasons, I now park at my son's school and I walk down to work, which is about a 20-minute walk for me. And I've never done that before. I've often chosen other ways, but this is something I'm really enjoying. And so I don't think we can assume any particular behaviour from people, because our lives have been fundamentally changed and people are thinking about things differently. So we did see some interesting data about working from home, and I do think that this is an important part of what the pandemic has brought for us, because it has definitely accelerated the way that we can work from home. And Transurban itself pivoted very quickly, and we had about 95% of our workforce working from home very quickly. And there is a lot of opportunity that comes from that. But as I mentioned previously, overwhelmingly the data does suggest that people do want to go back to their workplaces. The other really interesting thing that came out of the data was online shopping. And so about 48% of people have increased their online shopping habits. But the other interesting thing is that the same number are saying that they're going to continue to do so. So fascinating for me, because I'm definitely one of those online shoppers. But what is really interesting about that is what it's meant for transport, and the rise of trucks on our transport system. And I have got to the point where my children, husband and neighbours know every time a truck turns up outside my front door. But that is definitely something that we're seeing a lot more of, and it seems that this is going to be a fixture of our transport system. And so what does that mean for us going forward? So overall, the main things that we were seeing from this research is that there have been fundamental changes like we have never seen, and changes like we never could have anticipated. And potentially some of those changes may stay, and there may be some more dramatic changes in that short to medium term. But the bit that's really interesting about this data is that what we're hearing from the customers and community that we surveyed is that probably some of those more drastic and permanent changes that have been predicted are less likely. And it's probably going to be an integration of a lot of different things, hopefully taking the good and being able to, create a system that works, hopefully in even a more positive way for us going forward. And I think one of those really important things that will enable us to do that is technology, because, the article that Sarah referred to talked a lot about congestion and quite significant congestion. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, because we do have an integrated transport system, and it's so important that it is a multimodal transport system. And technology really does provide us with so much opportunity to enable us to have systems that work more efficiently, that enable people to understand transport, to have communication about what's going on at different times. And I think that all of these things will contribute quite significantly to a much more efficient transport system moving forward. And I think that technology-led future is a really important part of the transport system as well, because it's evolving very, very quickly. That we often say that this is the biggest revolution we've seen since the movement from horse and cart. But the other thing that Transurban often says is that we started as an engineering company that built roads. Now we are a high-tech roads company, and we've got 40% of our staff who sit in technology now. So technology is part of the future, and I think when we start this conversation about the future, it's really important that that does feature in it. The other thing that I think is worth commenting on during this time is community and engagement with community, because obviously that's such an important part of what we do. And people has been at the forefront of this pandemic. So it was very much front of mind for Transurban as well. And in the peak of the pandemic, one of the things that we wanted to do was to be able to support people, and particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, frontline workers, and also people who had been significantly impacted by the pandemic. So whether that was essential workers needing to get to work, or whether it was people whose income had been impacted and they were working reduced hours. So we implemented a toll credit program, which enabled people to apply. And during the pandemic, they've been able to access our roads and move around the city as quickly and as easily as they needed to. And that was something that we wanted to do that was a very real and tangible way to support the communities that we work with. To date, we have had over $7.4 million in toll credits, and we've supported more than 33,000 customers. So there was a genuine need that people did want to be able to access their cities, and we were really proud to be able to help with that. The other area where we saw a very important need during this time was with community groups. And one of the most challenging things for community groups is that the pandemic fundamentally changed the way that they engage with their partners, and for some of them their fundraising was turned off overnight. And so a very important part of what we saw during this time was how we could support those groups, because the other thing that happened is that people were seeking support more, and so many of these community groups were the busiest they'd ever been, but they didn't have the support that they needed. So we looked at, we tripled our community grants program, and to enable these community groups to be able to, continue doing the amazing work that they do. And then the final piece around community is really a combination of community and technology, and obviously something that is so important to us is how we communicate in a two-way fashion with all of the people that we interact with. And when we were suddenly told that we couldn't do anything face-to-face, we couldn't meet with people, we couldn't gather, we couldn't do any of these things, it really turned a lot of our processes on our head. And we had to pivot really quickly, because construction was still occurring, and we were still opening roads and engaging in a lot of different ways with our community. But we couldn't do all the things that we typically did. So we had to think differently, and we called on technology to help us, because we knew that our core intent was to be able to interact in a two-way way with people. And so some of the really interesting things that we did was we virtually opened the M8 using virtual tours and purpose-built online engagement platform. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that often if we would do an opening day, we'd probably in physical attendance get about 1,000 people. Online, we had over 40,000 visitors. and we had over 100,000 views of the information. So the really exciting thing about that is we feel like there was a really high level of engagement, and it enabled us to communicate with a vast majority of people. So that's quite an exciting outcome that came from something that we never expected. We did online open day for North Connects as well, and we also established a Westgate Tunnel community liaison group digitally. And during the pandemic, we actually had the highest attendance ever with that group. So it's really interesting to see how technology during a time of need, and when we've all had to learn how to use technology and get ourselves on mute and do all of these different things, how it's also enabled us to continue to think about how we engage with community. So I think overall, things have changed. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But what that looks like going forward will be very interesting to see. I think the most important thing is that pre-COVID, the task of transport was shared across so many areas of the transport sector, and it's so important that that continues. And we don't believe that congestion is an inevitable part of returning to the workplaces. There are so many different options, whether that's around flexible working hours, leveraging data technologies. But what's important is that we continue to have a conversation about this. We have a conversation with people, and we give people choice about the way that they travel. And I think that connecting with people is really important. And we saw, as I mentioned before, just how important that was, even when we were in our homes. And it's important for conversations now, but it's also important for that long-term conversation about how it is that we work in our cities. So I think that there are many questions. There are lots and lots of questions still, and I don't know that anyone necessarily has all of the answers, but I think what we definitely know is that there's a huge opportunity for us to have a conversation about this. And if we consider what we want that future city to look like, it's really quite an exciting opportunity for us. And it's an opportunity for all of our sectors, whether it's business, government, universities, and the community, to come together and to talk about ultimately how it is that we want to create a more efficient way of getting people around and living the life that they want to live. And I think that if we can achieve this, potentially we will make our post-pandemic lives a little better. So thanks, Sarah.
Heidi, thank you so much. I really appreciate your comments and thinking about integration, thinking about, the opportunity that we have now to kind of, as you stated, balance these opportunities. And also maybe, as you say, like to be pleasantly surprised by being forced to use some of these technologies and seeing that, oh, well, actually we are getting more community members involved and more engagement. And you ended there with this kind of vision towards the future. What's transport going to look like? And since I'm, the host and I can do these things, I'd be really interested to ask you, looking to next year or perhaps, 2022, when we're really hopeful that things are going to be more like what we know normal to be, and we're well and truly in this kind of different space. What do you think that urban transport landscape is going to look like?
Yeah, well, and I think that there is an opportunity, and I think that's the important thing here. I think without a doubt, it's got to be integrated. It has to be multimodal. I think that this pandemic has enabled us to think differently about things. And so I think that, the photos that you were showing before about cycle, the scooters that pass me now, there's a lot of them, people walking, there are lots of different ways. And I think choice and efficiency with safety is going to be such an important part of going forward. It'll be really interesting to hear Mark's views from an epidemiologist perspective around people's views on behaviour. But I do think that definitely for the short term, which your question was 2021, 2022, that safety will continue to be a prevalent thought in people's mind. But the reality is we've all got busy lives as well, and so convenience is going to be part of that factor, as well as we start to move into this new phase of life in 2021 and beyond.
Thanks, Heidi. Now, for our audience members, if you haven't been on Zoom webinar before, we have a really handy Q&A feature. And we do encourage you, go ahead and if you'd like to type some of your questions there before you forget all of the great things that Heidi has just talked about, because we're going to move on in a second to Professor Mark Stevenson. Go ahead and list your questions there. We are going to come back after Mark presents us with his perspectives to have a full-on Q&A. But thank you so much, Heidi Cooper. We really appreciate your comments and your vision for the future. We'll come back to you shortly. I would like now, though, to turn to my good colleague and Melbourne buddy, Professor Mark Stevenson. You are an epidemiologist, but also, as Kirsty noted earlier, a jack of many trades. You lead one of Australia's top institutes on urban transport. And so public health and transport, I think it's such an important, but also it's a very, until today, unique combination. You were really a leader in this space, bringing these two fields together. So we're going to be very interested to hear from you about bringing those fields together. I think, though, it is important for everyone in the group to know that Professor Mark Stevenson, as I just mentioned, he is an epidemiologist. He's professor of urban transport and public health at the University of Melbourne. And there he directs the Transport, Health and Urban Design Research Lab. So for those of you on the webinar today who are interested in these topics, we really encourage you to look up Mark's lab at the University of Melbourne. His appointment sits across, really interestingly, a number of schools within the university. So this is truly what I would call transdisciplinary research. And Mark, you can choose how you wish to describe it, but Mark's appointment sits across the Melbourne School of Design, Engineering, and Population and Global Health. So he's kind of got it all. And he's worked on numerous national and international projects that have directly influenced transport policy. And here in Australia, he's worked both with the Commonwealth and state governments, but also internationally. And his current work is exploring how the effects of urban form and transportation then influence the health of residents in cities. So really, Mark, you could not be doing more topical work for the pandemic environment we find ourselves in. And we'd love to hear from you now as to some of your perspectives on these key issues that we're attempting to tackle today. Professor Mark Stevenson.
Look, thank you, Sarah. And again, thank you for the invite. And it was just terrific listening to your introduction and also Heidi's, and I think really pertinent points. And so I thought, instead of sort of just adding to those really valuable points, I'm just going to transgress a little and just go back to COVID and March, and putting my epidemiology hat on, because I think it gives a really good context to the future of cities and this word that seems to be ruminating quite a bit today, which is that of integration. And I think, Sarah, you also pointed out really well this transdisciplinary approach that I've been sort of adopting, and I think that is a really valuable piece as we move post-COVID into our future cities and future focus. So in March, the research lab that I had, we were doing some really unique modelling. Apologies for all of those of you who don't do or are not familiar with a lot of this sort of simulation modelling, but we were doing, I'd sort of moved beyond sort of some of the epidemiologic sort of risk factor type modelling, and we've moved into very much understanding behavioural modelling and the effects it might have on policies. We were using this concept called an agent-based model, and I imagine a number of you on this seminar today would be very familiar with it. And it's a unique simulation modelling that allows you to look at the influence of the sort of dynamic influence of policies or what is happening and how people are behaving at the time, and the influence that might have in the future. And we had developed a terrific model, and then COVID came along and we thought, gosh, why don't we apply that to COVID, and let's have a look to see whether we can actually predict what policies are likely to be more effective in terms of delivering a post-COVID period in a shorter time frame than we would hope. And so we started to do that, and what we did is just mix this behavioural approach with the more traditional epidemiology approach, which is typically referred to as the SEIR model, which is sort of susceptibility, exposed, infected, and you recover model. And in that model, you have all of those values now that most in Australia know about. And I must admit, I go to parties now and everyone knows what an epidemiologist does. I'm no longer a skin doctor. So the sort of public awareness around epidemiology and the R naught that everyone sort of knows about now and how infectious the virus is sort of public vernacular now. So we applied those, we combined these approaches, and when we're able to, for the first time, begin to model what was happening both in Australia and in this instance, we were looking at New Zealand, and we were able to predict that New Zealand would eliminate the virus in a very short time frame, and it actually predicted it within days of what we had in the model. It actually happened. And fortunately, the Victorian government saw the value or the utility of this model and picked it up as well. And we were able to provide the modelling for the roadmap out for Victoria. And again, it predicted right to the day that we had over a 14-day period of average of 5 cases, and we could predict that the likelihood of a third wave before Christmas was going to be as low as 3%. So incredibly valuable, and it had influence in decision making immediately. Now, how this fits into transport was that I was particularly interested to understand the dilemma that we were seeing with public transport, particularly and around the drop in usage, what implications that would have, how much risk was there associated with our public transport system. And the challenge we had there was that we didn't have the empirical data to place into our models because we were in lockdown and weren't able to get out there and observe. But what we were able to find out was that some of the variables we put into our model sort of gave us an insight around what might happen in terms of public transport. And the most important one was that social distancing element. And I think what we saw play out then, and what we've seen play out now in every major city around public transport and COVID, was this move away from mass transit systems in favour of personal transport. I guess that it was not something we could actually change in our models, but what we were able to see was that, okay, if we are to go back into our public transit system and encourage people to be patrons again of it, how could we facilitate and reduce that risk? And that's what we were able to model in this COVID-19 model, was the effectiveness of mask wearing. And we could actually show just what effects mask wearing has, not only in the community, but in terms of close proximity, in terms of reducing the contagion. So there was enormous utility from that, which was incredibly valuable. But given my hat on public health and transport focus, we weren't able to answer some of the key questions that I was particularly interested in. So what we looked at then was to look at every city globally to see what were the transmission rates of COVID like, and were they differing between cities that had very high public transit use or not necessarily use, but actual infrastructure, versus cities that had very little public transit infrastructure. And so we had undertaken a piece of research where we looked at every city in the world, and we used unique artificial intelligence approaches that we developed in our lab to define cities based on their transport system and their urban typology. And so we were the first group to basically classify city design into 9 unique typologies based on the delivery of public transit infrastructure, on green space, blue space, and road networks. And so taking those typologies, and I won't go into a huge amount of detail on it, but it was fascinating to find that in the Asia Pacific area, the majority, only a handful of cities were deemed what we call motor cities. And those are particularly the Australian cities, where they have low investments in public transit, extensive investments in road networks, and the associated green and blue space. But also in the Asia Pacific, there were some cities that have what we called high transit cities, like Tokyo and Singapore, that had invested heavily in public transport. So it was fascinating to look at how cities around the world fell into these 9 typologies. In some countries, all of their cities had the same urban form, and other countries like China, there was just massive diversity of city form based on whether you were on the east coast or the west coast of the country. We then applied the COVID transmission rates for those cities. And our hypothesis was that, clearly cities that had very high levels of public transit investment we would have assumed that they would likely have high transmission rates, given that everyone would be in close proximity to each other. You would expect that that would be the case. And surprisingly, from our research, we found that that was not the case. So an assumption you would just immediately make that public transit would be a huge high risk for transmission. What we found is it didn't apply. And when we explored that more, what we found was that the most overriding feature that predicted the transmission rates in those cities was how proactive the city governance was in those cities. So if the city governance was powerful and enacted change, enacted policies immediately to move into a lockdown in a short time frame, you saw dramatic change. In cities where that wasn't, there was a period where there was discussion and lag period, then we actually started to see, quite considerable increase in transmission rates. So clearly this sort of research is ecologic in nature. What I mean by that is there's a whole bunch of biases that creep into exploring that. But I think nonetheless it found what it did show us in this piece of work was that the assumption that high population dense cities are going to be a significantly high risk does not necessarily hold up. And I think it reflects the resilience of the cities, I think probably more, and we haven't looked at resilience as a construct, but it probably reflects a level of resilience in a city in terms of how it responds to these sorts of disruptions, and the pandemic is certainly a significant disruptor in how we operate. So I guess that's sort of my epidemiology and the interaction with urban transport, and it really then takes me to then think and ruminate on the future, and really much of what you've said, Sarah, and also the terrific work, Heidi, you presented in terms of what Transurban have done from their surveys. Really, I concur with in that. I think what we need to be very mindful of here in relation to the pandemic and what COVID has delivered to what we deem now an urban age. I mean, we've probably in the last 10 years talked extensively about digital disruption and the digital age, but I think the important point here is that we now live in an urban age and a highly urbanized age. We're highly urbanized, and the digital disruption is, disruption by in terms of its definition, it appears quite negative, but in fact it has enormous, opportunity associated with that disruption as well. And I see the pandemic as doing exactly the same. I think there is enormous opportunity here. And some of what we're proposing and some of what we're discussing today is we're assuming, we're guessing what might play out. But I think the elements that are probably going to remain with us is the change in our work environment. And so there will be a proportion of the population, of the working population, who will create a local environment. They will be working at home and they will be exploring the local environment on a day-to-day basis. So in fact, that has enormous opportunity for cities in relation to infrastructure. Because what that means is and I think, Sarah, you mentioned it, or it may come from Heidi, and just in terms of, they're guessing that might remain 15% of people might remain working from home or partially working from home. That 15% is a substantial proportion. Some of the research that I have done where I've looked at the effects of compact cities and what health gains we might achieve in a compact city, I modeled what the health gains might be if you saw a 10% modal shift from private motor vehicles into other forms, predominantly cycling, walking. Now, that 10% shift delivered huge health gains. So if we're saying that we can potentially get a 15% benefit, individuals working from home, that sort of mode shift will certainly be reflected in that workplace shift. And that is a huge gain for us, because what that means is the delivery of our transport system can also shift. Micromobility, for example, will certainly come to the fore. And Australia has been very slow, I think, in adopting micromobility, and for a whole bunch of reasons, which I'm not going to go into. When you see that 15%, potentially 15% of the workforce could be working in a local area, micromobility for the last mile, the first mile, or for the entire trip that's under 5 kilometres, which we know in Melbourne, for example, 14% of all car trips are under 5 kilometres. Micromobility becomes a very exciting, clean, sustainable option. And I didn't say safe option, but I think it's one that we can ensure is safe as well. So the big take from the work that we've done and currently doing is that public transit has been hammered as a consequence of COVID. The risks associated with transit, I think, the empirical evidence is very difficult to measure, but I think some of the work that we have been doing has highlighted that it is certainly not as significant a risk that the public necessarily perceive. And so I do see that there will be a move back to public transit. But public transit in post-COVID era is truly got to be an integrated transit system. And I think that's the exciting opportunities that we're going to see in terms of delivering our urban transport system in post-COVID period.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think, you know, the work that you've done to create these typologies of city design and to then think through how have these cities and types of cities experienced the pandemic, the questions that you're raising around, you know, I think there's a real challenge that the epidemiologists face, and that you're so good at modeling. And what we want to do is we want to trust your data. We want to say, yes, these guys have the answer and we're all going to be safe. And I think, you know, we're so thankful to you and Professor Tony Blakely and Jason Thompson, the people who've done the modeling here in Victoria that have helped us to get on the good side of things. But there is always this issue of trust with data and of helping the public to understand the measures and the models that are being used to take decisions. So, and I think this will be of interest to Heidi too, because she does a lot of work on social license to operate, which is steeped in concerns about trust. From your perspective, what do you think the work now is to be done to help the public to have trust and advice if it tends to go against their intuition, particularly about public transport?
Look, a great question, and I feel, and I'm talking about this as an academic, of 25 years. I think the 21st century is one where we no longer sit in an ivory tower and collect data and crunch the numbers. And you know my feeling on this era, that we really need to co-design everything that we're doing with the community. And the value add from that will be phenomenal. So I think the trust comes from us reaching out to the community from day one, not reaching out when we've got the results and talk through the results and how can they be implemented, but actually reaching out at day one so that they see the robustness of what we do, they understand the limitations of what we do, and so that ultimately when we make recommendations or we create a decision platform that allows policymakers to implement, that they feel that they have contributed to that and understand the opportunities that are out there for us. So I think it's an exciting journey, to use that word, but I think it's an exciting journey in terms of building trust with the community now. And I think your group, you know, there's just such a need for it. So it makes sense to establish an institute around that.
Thank you. Look, we completely agree. And Heidi, I can imagine that you might like to come in on this issue as well, particularly having heard Mark's points and some of the data that's starting to come out from his team. What would your advice be? How do we make sure that if we do have good advice around safe public transport use, and that perhaps it's not going to be as individually dangerous as people might be thinking, how are we going to build trust in this data, and how are we going to build trust in the next steps that we need to take as a society to kind of shift into this post-pandemic environment?
Yeah, look, I think it's a not only a fascinating topic, but such an important topic as well. And I could not agree more. Mark, as soon as the words co-design came out of your mouth, you had me at hello. That was absolutely the number one thing that I think we need to be thinking about. We're going through a really interesting phase in the world at the moment, and trust has really had quite a phenomenal turnaround. Many people will be aware that for a long time research was suggesting that major institutions weren't trusted globally, whereas research has suggested that during this time there is a much greater willingness of the public and the community to trust institutions. And so therefore that to me suggests that there's this really positive opportunity to be having co-design and co-communication opportunities. From an advice perspective, I think what is going to be so critical are those two-way conversations and hearing and genuinely hearing from from all of our stakeholders and understanding what it is that people's concerns are, but also where the opportunities are as well. But I also think as well that what will be so important, some of those pillars that we talk about in the establishment of trust is that people look for credibility. So it's that sense that the person that they're hearing from knows what they're doing and what they're talking about, and they can trust that. They want to believe that people have the right intent and that they do have their best interests at heart when they are providing that information. And integrity is also critical. So I think when we think about that, and it's not just public transport, the reality is that there are so many areas in all different levels of our society that are needing, they're asking for a leap of faith, and they're asking for people to trust. And I think the way to do that is to co-design, to communicate, to listen, and to think about those core pillars. Because I think I haven't been on a plane yet, but I think the aviation industry is obviously thinking about this a lot. Public transport's thinking about it. Employers with their people coming back to work, but every aspect of our life. What is so important is that we work with each other and we work together to get to whatever it is that this next phase is going to look like.
I was on mute. Heidi, I completely agree. And I think one of the really practical questions and that I'd like to follow on with that is the way that organizations like Transurban build trust is primarily through your community engagement. And you mentioned in your talk how some of the ways that you're doing that engagement necessarily had to shift because of the pandemic. Are there components of that you expect to take into what we hope will soon be a post-pandemic environment? How has that experience really changed your methods of community engagement? What's going to stick? What do you never want to have to do again?
It's a great question, and and I think the first answer is we're still learning. So we're still learning, what worked for people and what didn't work for people, and we're still trying to hear from people about that. But I would have to say there's some huge positives that when I talk about the difference in the numbers of accessibility that people were able to be a part of. Whether it's online forums or just participating in digital experiences, that's quite a phenomenal shift. When you have 1,000 people turn up to an open day compared to 40,000 online, they're numbers that you can't ignore. That's a very high level of engagement. So there's definitely a benefit, is what I'm trying to say. But is it a benefit in isolation? That's the bit I think we still need to work through. And one of the things that I wonder about is whether we're going to look at some hybrid models, because the human contact is still very much desirable, and there's so much to be gained from that as well. So I think I think if we had an ideal scenario, Sarah, we'd be looking at situations where we can increase accessibility, we can increase the advantage of having online open days was people could do it whenever they wanted to. They could do it when they got home from work if they wanted to. So there's a lot of opportunity that comes from that. But I think what's really important is that we also listen to what people still desire, and I think that potentially what that means is there'll be various hybrid models that enables accessibility, enables people to communicate in a way that's convenient to them, but then also allows human contact as well.
Heidi, I think you couldn't be more spot on about this importance of hybridity, and Mark mentioned this word as well, and you've both talked about integration. Certainly, you know, one of the things I love about forums like this is we get to bring together industry and government and universities, and we're all kind of saying, well, these are the experiences that we're having, and we're doing this over here, and really trying to learn from one another. And certainly in our experience at the universities, it's a similar thing when we think to our main stakeholder group, our students. And so this year we've really had to shift to online teaching. And now we're thinking about, okay, next year when we've got international cohorts that maybe can't be on campus, but we've got some students who are just itching to get back in the classroom, you know, how do we create these kind of hybrid spaces, and how do we do it in a way that is genuinely engaging for both the people who are there with us face to face and the people who are interacting with us online? And so for me, drawing from that experience this year, shifting to online learning, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can share across community engagement as well, and thinking about how do we effectively engage people in both mediums, and what do we do in, say, 2021, 2022, where we have situations where we're needing to engage people both online and in person. So how do we create this hybrid situation that benefits many more stakeholders, whoever they are, relative to our profession, at the same time as ensuring we don't create, for instance, kind of second-class citizens where the online experience is less, I suppose, fulfilling than the in-person experience. So I think this is going to be a big question for us in community engagement, as well as for myself in my teaching. And I'm sure that's something Mark can reflect on as well. We do have a few questions coming into the Q&A, and two of these questions are quite technical questions, and I would like to direct these first towards Mark. But Heidi, if you happen to know anything about antimicrobial copper alloys, you can certainly jump in. So Peter Ramos in the audience today asks, have any Australian transit or comparable industries tested the use of antimicrobial copper alloys on surfaces as a form of proactive countermeasure to COVID-19 or future viruses that might be in our transit systems, rolling stock, or high touch customer contact areas? Mark, you know anything about that one?
Unfortunately, I'm a Johnny come lately to the infectious disease epidemiology. I started out on infectious disease epidemiology about 25 years ago, but I really only came back to it just this year. So look, Mary Louise, who we'd all know from TV, would probably be better equipped to answer that question than I would. But I do recall there was a lot of discussion early days around, you know, the ability to ensure that we can minimize transmission through contact. So, but I'm not across the literature on it, so unfortunately I can't answer that one.
That is okay. We appreciate your, you know, professional situation of having to say that's not something that I research. We do have another question here, which I think you will be able to answer because it is quite related to your own modeling. And the question comes from Susan Crawford, who said, did your city public transport transmission rate research, the modeling that you mentioned in your talk, did it look at other COVID transmission mitigating factors, including compulsory face masks, distance seating, or community testing rates, those types of things?
Look, unfortunately, it didn't, because as you could imagine, when we were looking at 1,600 cities, and in order to do this in a pretty timely fashion, you know, a lot of the data is never captured at a city level, you know, particularly if it's, you know, we're relying on WHO data collection, and it all reported at a country level. So unfortunately, we weren't able to look at that sort of level. So our models are very much macro focused, macro level models, rather than sort of meso and even micro level models. But again, you know, they're really very, very important questions, and I think ones that would be valuable to look at, you know, on a city basis, certainly.
Fantastic. We have one other question from Peter, and I really encourage other members of our audience to come in here, because now is your chance. We've got about 7 minutes left for questions with our expert panelists. Peter's asked, and this is an easy question, I can tell you, what's the biggest challenge for Australian transport for the sector in 2021, and some potential solutions that you might see? He's given some ideas here about potentially building back ridership through ceding ground permanently to TNCs or telecommute work from home. But Heidi, I'll turn to you first. What do you see as the biggest challenge to building back, and what would be the potential solutions?
I think it's a really good question. And I have to say, I think the biggest challenge is if we look at things in absolutes and don't think of things in a holistic way. And I know that's been a theme of this conversation, but that is absolutely my view in relation to this. Is I think that we are in an immediate situation right now, and we're needing to act in particular ways right now. But when we talk about transport infrastructure, when we talk about integrated transport systems, when we talk about cities and future cities, and what we want our cities and our lives to look like, these are all really long-term issues, and we need to be thinking long-term about it. I think a lot of change has happened in the last year, and that is disruptive. Mark spoke, really clearly about that when he was talking. And disruption brings change. There's no doubt about that. But disruption also brings opportunity. And I think what is really important is that that we evolve in a way that enables us to look at the long term.
Mark, biggest challenges, opportunities?
Yeah, look, just to add to that, I think there's enormous, with this disruption, there is enormous opportunity, which we've talked about. But I think it's going to be, we're at a critical juncture. I think what it's going to highlight are cities that I perceive are resilient cities. And the resilient cities I define as cities that are capable of responding to change in the environment. And they are not complacent. And I think within Australia, we are going to see a rise in cities that are truly resilient. And I believe that those cities will be ones that will embrace the disruption, and they will require now, and I mean by embracing the disruption, I mean they're going to have levels of governance and leadership that actually say, okay, there's been this significant modal shift. Why don't we embrace that and support it, given that it is supporting sustainable, future transport. So I'm talking particularly here in terms of this active transport transition that we've seen. Now, I think there's a real opportunity that cities can seize on those disruptions and change for good. And I know Heidi's sort of saying we do need to not lose sight of the long term, and I think that is important. But I think if we miss these opportunities now, then it'll take many, many years, I think, to truly try and gauge the levels of modal shift that I modelled in 2016 in Melbourne, and I modelled in 6 other cities to say, if we just assume we could get this 10% modal shift. It's happened in an overnight like this. Now, here's an opportunity. Let's see how resilient we are in terms of. So the biggest challenge we're seeing here is it is going to require a level of leadership that we haven't seen typically in our state governments for quite a while. And so I'm putting that out there as a challenge for governance to take the lead, take the mantle, and make us. It's really going to be required around policy making to ensure that we can deliver a much better, more sustainable future transport system.
And Mark, just to that, in these webinars, we're really fortunate to have a cross section of industry. We've got a lot of government representatives in our audience today, as well as fellow academics. If you had to suggest to these individuals as they go into this new environment and they're taking advantage of these disruptions, and I suppose in many ways through doing that, supporting resilience, what would be the kind of 3 priorities that you would suggest they have as they focus on this opportunity?
Well, I guess, what my imprimatur really, what's driving me at the moment, and I think will for the rest of my career, is the real focus around sustainability. So so really what I am keen to see here is I think we need to be quite aggressive around what we can achieve in terms of our multimodal options and offerings, and it really links nicely to what Heidi highlighted. And so I would really be encouraging micromobility. It taps into the evolution in technology that we're seeing. It allows us to gamify individual users so that we can ensure that, for example, I'm just giving an illustration, that the e-bikes or the e-scooters are if they return near an area which will link to our public transit, for example, you will get reward. The research that we have done in our lab on potential reward, financial rewards, we know it influences driving behaviours. It will certainly influence active transport type modes as well. So I would be saying seize the opportunity here now. I know there are a lot of micro mobility companies knocking on doors of government at the moment. So this is the opportunity to not lose that fifth. We saw a third increase in active transport. That's phenomenal. So let's not lose that. So I guess that's what I would be saying to our policymakers. Work through how you might be able to integrate with micromobility, public transit, to ensure that we can maintain and advocate for a sustainable future transport.
And Heidi, a similar or same question to you, really. With Transurban is recognised widely as a leader in this space, both within Australia and internationally. So what are going to be your priorities to really leverage what's been a pretty difficult situation, but from which, through discussions like this, hopefully as well, we can extract some benefit?
Yeah, and that's, I think, definitely been not only a theme of this conversation, but definitely a conversation that we are having at Transurban, which is that, to Mark's point about, where are the opportunities that have come, and how is it that we can continue to, whether that's from community or whether it's from a sustainability perspective, what are those strong benefits that we can look at going forward in the future? And we are already looking at what that future piece does look like, and we just recently announced that we're committed to a zero emission target by 2050, and I think that is an important step for us to be thinking about, because of it enables us to put in place really important steps for us to be charting that path about how it is that we want to move forward. So I think that we have talked a lot about what that next phase looks like, and I think that by continuing to look at the opportunities that present itself at the moment, learning from this extraordinary experience that we have all been through together, listening to the community, and then moving in a way that is positive and taking the positive with us, I think that can only be a good outcome for everyone.
And I think we've all had a year where we are really looking forward to some good outcomes and to some positive things happening. The chat box is still open, so if anyone does have a final question, you feel free to send those in. Otherwise, we're going to be very conscious of people moving towards other things offline and hopefully towards your own lunch. It has been an absolute pleasure to have Heidi Cooper and Professor Mark Stevenson with us today. We really appreciate everyone's attendance. It is always a pleasure to hold a Next Generation Engagement event and to have so many of our partners and industry professionals participating with us. So thank you for your time and attention. For those of you who may not yet be part of our amazing network, we do have a regular e-news that we put out. So if you're interested in going on to our list and joining up to find out more about what it is that we do and to attend more events like this, please do scan the QR code. We're all getting really good at QR code scanning, I think, and here in Victoria, that's just become a must. So scan that QR code. It will take you to our website and you can sign up for our e-news. Any questions, ideas, or future topics that you would like to see discussed, this is now an ongoing thing that we do in lieu of our regular in-person industry events. So please do shoot those through to us. We're really happy to pick up the topics and issues that industry find most pressing and most interesting. It is what we do here at the Next Gen Engagement Program. It's wonderful to have had so many of you with us today. There will also be a recording of this webinar available through our website if you wish to share the discussion with colleagues. The chat box is blinking, so I'm just going to click on it and make sure that I haven't missed anything today. All good. Kirsty O'Connell, who's our industry director, has listed her mobile and her personal email address in the chat box. So anyone who would like to get in touch with Kirsty directly, please find the information there. To our esteemed panelists, Heidi Cooper, Professor Mark Stevenson, thank you again for your time, your ideas, and for sharing so generously your expertise. Thank you to our audience, and thank you to Kirsty O'Connell, Industry Director. We'll see you on the internet.
See you, Sarah. Well done. That's great, Sarah.